The unforeseen union. Caspian Hale, a beta who's always cherished his independence, lives a quiet, humble life away from the rigid expectations of aristocratic society. When he finds himself in a compromising situation with Sinclair Everstone, an alpha with a reputation for arrogance, his world shatters. The arranged marriage to Sinclair is forced upon him as a result of the scandal, a situation neither of them expected. The evening of their marriage is tense, filled with the weight of unspoken words. As they stand in the dim light of their chamber, Sinclair adjusts his cravat, stealing a glance at Caspian. He is the picture of aloofness, but there's an unmistakable undercurrent of something else, something darker, something more raw. "You know this is all a mistake," Caspian mutters, voice tight with frustration, his hands trembling slightly as he undoes his coat. Sinclair turns toward him, his gaze hard but with an edge of something softer, more vulnerable. "Mistakes are often made out of necessity, Caspian." The name is said with a strange intensity, and for a moment, they are locked in an exchange that neither can quite decipher. The air between them crackles, and before either of them can speak again, Sinclair steps closer. Caspian's breath hitches as Sinclair's hand brushes against his arm, the heat of the touch searing him despite the gentle contact. "I don't know what to do with you," Caspian admits, the words heavy with frustration and an unfamiliar longing. Sinclair's lips curl into a small smile, but it's not mocking, it's something softer. "Perhaps you'll learn to trust me. Despite the circumstances." The intimacy lingers, an emotional connection sparking in the midst of their tension. Neither speaks, but both know that something irreversible has been set into motion, even though neither is ready to acknowledge it fully. 2. The weight of duty. The next day, Sinclair reveals startling news. His father has been murdered, and he has inherited the title of Duke of Blackmore. The responsibility weighs heavily on him, and Caspian, despite his reservations, feels a strange pull to the situation, realizing that the quiet life he had planned for himself is now irrevocably changed. As they sit in Sinclair's study, discussing the implications of the murder and the future of the estate, their proximity creates a tension neither can escape. Sinclair, ever the image of control, rubs a hand over his face in frustration. "I never asked for this," Sinclair confesses, his voice low. "None of this was supposed to be my life." Caspian, despite his annoyance, finds himself looking at Sinclair differently. He sees not the arrogant alpha from the night before, but a man burdened with a new world of responsibility. Without thinking, Caspian reaches out, placing a hand on Sinclair's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. "You don't have to do this alone," Caspian murmurs, his voice surprisingly gentle. Sinclair freezes for a moment, then turns toward him. There's a shift in his gaze, something raw and vulnerable that Caspian hasn't seen before. Sinclair places his own hand over Caspian's, holding it there for a long beat, his thumb brushing the back of Caspian's hand in a subtle but intimate gesture. Without a word, Sinclair leans forward, his lips brushing against Caspian's forehead, a gesture that is both intimate and tender. Caspian closes his eyes, feeling the warmth of Sinclair's touch sear into him. He doesn't pull away. "I don't know what this is between us," Sinclair admits, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't ignore it anymore." Caspian's heart races, his breath hitching at the words. This moment, despite all the tension and history, feels oddly like the beginning of something neither of them fully understands. 3. Closer than before. The days that follow are filled with tension, and yet, the undeniable pull between them continues to grow. Caspian tries to keep his distance, but every time they are in the same room, his gaze lingers on Sinclair. It's impossible to ignore the way Sinclair's presence fills the space around him, like a storm waiting to happen. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day filled with meetings about the estate, Sinclair invites Caspian to join him for a quiet drink in the library. They sit close, the fire crackling in the hearth, and the sound of their conversation fills the otherwise silent room. Caspian, with a glass of wine in his hand, finds himself leaning in towards Sinclair. "I didn't think this marriage would end up like this." Sinclair meets his gaze, his voice low. "I didn't either." The air between them is thick with unspoken desires. Caspian watches as Sinclair's fingers idly trace the edge of his glass, his hand steady, but the tension radiating off of him is palpable. The physical distance between them feels unbearable, as if they both want something more but can't quite bring themselves to cross that line. Suddenly, Sinclair's hand is on Caspian's wrist, pulling him toward him gently. His thumb brushes over the pulse point, sending a jolt of heat through Caspian's veins. "You're more than just a marriage of convenience to me, Caspian," Sinclair murmurs, his voice rough with emotion. "And I can't pretend otherwise anymore." Before Caspian can respond, Sinclair pulls him closer, his lips meeting Caspian's in a kiss that is slow at first, exploratory. The moment is delicate but full of yearning, both of them tasting the depths of the unspoken emotions between them. Caspian responds hesitantly at first, but soon, he finds himself lost in the kiss, his arms wrapping around Sinclair's neck as their bodies align, the chemistry undeniable. Their kiss deepens, each touch intensifying as the boundaries between them begin to blur, until they are both breathless, their foreheads resting together. For tension unraveled. As the days pass, Sinclair and Caspian continue to struggle with the growing attraction between them. Despite their physical closeness, they remain emotionally distant. Sinclair's responsibilities as Duke continue to pull him away, and Caspian, frustrated by their unspoken desires, pulls back. One night, however, everything changes. Sinclair enters Caspian's room unannounced, finding him sitting by the window, staring out at the moonlit landscape. There's a stillness about him, an air of contemplation that Sinclair can't ignore. "I've tried to fight this," Sinclair admits, his voice tight with frustration. "But I can't anymore. I want you, Caspian." The words hang in the air between them, loaded with significance. Caspian turns toward him, eyes searching Sinclair's face for any sign of hesitation, but there is none. Without another word, Sinclair steps forward, cupping Caspian's face in his hands. He leans down, capturing Caspian's lips in a kiss that is urgent, desperate, filled with years of suppressed desire. This kiss is different from before. There is no hesitation, no pulling back. It's raw and real, an expression of everything they've been avoiding. Sinclair's hands trail down Caspian's back, pulling him closer, until their bodies are pressed together. Caspian can feel the heat of Sinclair's chest against his own, their hearts beating in sync. Their lips break apart for a moment, both gasping for air. Sinclair rests his forehead against Caspian's, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I've been fighting this for so long," Sinclair admits, his voice a low rasp. Caspian responds by kissing him again, deeper this time, not holding back. The world fades away, and in that moment, it's just the two of them. Chapter 5. Surrender. The days following that night are filled with a mix of tenderness and uncertainty. Both men are navigating the new depth of their relationship, trying to balance their growing affection with the realities of their duties. Their intimacy becomes more frequent, though they are still hesitant to fully acknowledge the bond they share. Sinclair, overwhelmed by the intensity of his feelings, finds solace in Caspian's quiet strength. Caspian, too, begins to soften, the walls around his heart starting to crack as he allows himself to feel. They begin to understand each other in ways neither expected. One evening, as they sit together in the drawing room, Sinclair reaches for Caspian's hand. His fingers intertwine with Caspian's, the simple gesture carrying more weight than either of them realizes. "I never thought I'd feel like this," Sinclair says softly, his voice full of vulnerability. "But I'm not fighting it anymore." Caspian looks into his eyes, his own feelings reflected there. "I don't want to fight it either." The connection between them is undeniable, and as their lips meet again, it's no longer just about desire. It's about something deeper, something lasting. And in that moment, they both know that their lives have changed forever. 6. Unspoken words. The fire crackled between them, its glow casting shadows across Sinclair's chiseled features. He stood by the window, arms crossed as though trying to shield himself from the storm of emotions that raged inside him. The distance between him and Caspian felt like an unspoken barrier that neither could break. Caspian watched him, his gaze intense, as if he was unraveling every thought that crossed Sinclair's mind. He took a step closer, his boots silent against the floor, and without a word, reached out. His touch was gentle at first, his fingertips brushing the side of Sinclair's neck. "You're pushing me away," Caspian murmured, his voice low and velvety, laden with a tension that Sinclair couldn't ignore. Sinclair's breath caught, his muscles tensing. He turned to face Caspian, eyes narrowing as the familiar pull between them became undeniable. There was something between them, something he couldn't escape even if he tried. "I don't know what you want from me," Sinclair muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Caspian leaned in, his lips brushing against Sinclair's ear, sending a jolt of electricity through him. "I want you. You know that." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither moved. Sinclair's heart pounded in his chest, his mind a swirl of confusion and desire. He wanted this. He had wanted this for so long. But the walls he'd built, the insecurities that plagued him, made it hard to give in. Before Sinclair could process his thoughts, Caspian closed the gap between them, capturing his lips in a kiss that was soft at first but quickly became desperate. Sinclair responded, his hands finding their way to Caspian's chest, fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt, feeling the heat of him, the strength, the undeniable need. 7. Burning desire. The kiss deepened, both men losing themselves in the fire they'd ignited. Caspian's hands slid down Sinclair's back, pulling him closer, until there was no space between them. The feel of Sinclair's body against his, the rapid beat of their hearts, was enough to make the world outside cease to exist. Sinclair's thoughts scattered as he felt Caspian's lips travel down his neck, his breath hot against his skin. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to give in to the sensation, his body responding to Caspian's every touch. It was as if his soul recognized this as something long overdue, something it had been waiting for. Caspian's hand slid beneath Sinclair's shirt, his fingertips grazing over the smooth expanse of his skin. Sinclair shuddered, his breath hitching as Caspian's touch grew more insistent, pulling him even closer. "You feel it too," Caspian murmured, voice husky. "You can't deny it." Sinclair's eyes fluttered open, meeting Caspian's gaze. The intensity in those eyes was enough to make his resolve falter. He knew the consequences of what this could mean, but it didn't matter. Not now. With a surge of courage, Sinclair kissed Caspian back, fiercely, as if trying to burn away all the doubts that had plagued him. Caspian responded eagerly, pushing him back against the nearest wall, his body pressing Sinclair into the cold surface. Their breaths mingled in the heat of their shared desire, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. 8. Surrendering control. The air in the room was thick with desire, and Sinclair could no longer ignore the overwhelming need pulsing through his veins. Caspian's hands roamed, expertly tracing the lines of his body, sending sparks of heat wherever they touched. "Caspian," Sinclair breathed, his voice breaking as Caspian's lips trailed down his chest, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. He felt as though he were unraveling, every part of him laid bare to the man before him. Caspian's fingers worked the buttons of Sinclair's shirt with practiced ease, his touch never faltering. "You're not the only one who's been holding back," Caspian murmured against Sinclair's skin, his words a low, soothing sound that made Sinclair's pulse race. Sinclair's hands found Caspian's face, pulling him into another kiss, desperate this time, raw and needy. Their mouths crashed together, and for a brief moment, everything was just about them, about the way they fit, about the way they needed each other. Caspian's body pressed against Sinclair's, the heat between them growing unbearable. His hands worked to pull Sinclair's shirt off, his own body responding as Sinclair's hands traced his back, feeling the hard muscles beneath the fabric. For a brief moment, Sinclair hesitated. He wanted to stop, to regain control, but Caspian's hands were insistent, his touch gentle yet demanding. It was too late to turn back. 9. A fragile trust. The tension between them had reached a breaking point, and as Caspian kissed his way down Sinclair's chest, Sinclair knew there was no turning back. This moment, this connection, was everything. He allowed himself to give in fully to Caspian, to the heat, to the overwhelming desire that had been building between them for so long. Sinclair's fingers gripped the edge of Caspian's shirt, pulling it over his head. The sight of Caspian, his chest bare, his muscles rippling under the soft light, was enough to make Sinclair's heart race even faster. "You're sure?" Caspian's voice was low, his breath heavy with anticipation. He looked at Sinclair, searching for any sign of hesitation, any sign that he wasn't ready. Sinclair swallowed, his chest tightening with a mixture of fear and longing. "I'm sure," he whispered, his voice barely audible. And with that, Caspian's hands moved to Sinclair's waistband, pulling him closer, their bodies now fully in sync with the rhythm of their desire. There was no going back, no more doubt. 10. Breaking the barrier. Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion, the world outside irrelevant as the two of them moved together in a dance of passion and unspoken needs. Sinclair's mind was clouded with a heady mix of pleasure and fear, but in that moment, all he cared about was Caspian, the way his body felt, the way his lips claimed his skin. Caspian moved with precision, his hands knowing exactly where to touch, how to make Sinclair feel. Sinclair responded, his body trembling under the intensity of their connection. It was overwhelming, but it was also liberating. For the first time in a long time, he felt alive, unburdened by the weight of his fears. Their movements were urgent now, their bodies pressed together with a hunger that left no room for hesitation. Sinclair gasped as Caspian's hands found their way to his waist, pulling him in deeper, their breaths coming faster, their hearts pounding as one. Sinclair didn't hold back anymore. He let go of every ounce of doubt, every fear he had been carrying for so long. Caspian was his, and for once, Sinclair wasn't afraid to admit it. As the intensity of their connection reached its peak, Sinclair knew that this was just the beginning. There was still so much more to explore, but for now, this moment, this surrender, was enough. 11. Unraveling in the dark. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with heat, their bodies colliding in desperate urgency. Sinclair's mind was a blur of sensation, his hands trembling as they traced the lines of Caspian's sculpted body. He couldn't think, couldn't stop himself as his lips sought Caspian's, kissing him with an intensity that burned through every ounce of restraint he had left. Caspian responded in kind, his touch possessive and tender, pulling Sinclair closer as if he wanted to consume him whole. His hands roamed with purpose, exploring every inch of Sinclair's skin, tracing the muscles that tensed beneath his fingertips. Sinclair gasped as Caspian's lips left a trail of heat down his neck, nipping at his sensitive skin with a perfect amount of pressure. "God," Sinclair breathed, his body arching into Caspian's touch. Every nerve in his body was on fire, and he couldn't escape it. He didn't want to. Caspian pulled back just enough to look him in the eyes, the intensity of his gaze enough to send a shiver down Sinclair's spine. "You're everything I've wanted, Sinclair," he said, his voice rough and raw, a far cry from the controlled demeanor Sinclair was used to. "Don't pull away. Not now." Sinclair's heart pounded in his chest, his breath ragged as he let himself fall into the heat of the moment. He reached for the waistband of Caspian's pants, pulling them down in one swift motion, and in the same breath, Caspian did the same to him. Their bodies were now bare, skin against skin, the heat of their touch sending waves of desire crashing through Sinclair. The weight of the moment hung in the air, and for a heartbeat, Sinclair hesitated. He was exposed, vulnerable, more so than he had ever been in his life. But Caspian's hands were there, gentle but insistent, pulling him closer, his lips finding Sinclair's once more. The kiss was slow, deliberate, a stark contrast to the urgency that had been building between them. It was an exploration, an unspoken promise that this was only the beginning. 12. Fractured walls. Sinclair's pulse quickened as Caspian's hands slid down his sides, pulling him into a slow, deep kiss. He had never felt anything like this before. Every movement was deliberate, every touch calculated, and yet it felt as though it was happening of its own accord, as if they were meant to be here, like this. Caspian's lips never left his skin, moving down to his chest, his breath hot against Sinclair's sensitive flesh. Sinclair moaned, his body arching into the contact, unable to control the desperate need that surged within him. "Let me show you how much you mean to me," Caspian whispered between kisses, his words sending shivers through Sinclair's body. "I've wanted you for so long, Sinclair." Sinclair's mind spun with the intensity of the moment, the rush of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He began, but his words caught in his throat as Caspian's lips found their way to his nipple, sucking gently. The sensation shot straight to Sinclair's groin, his body reacting instantly. He could barely hold himself together, his body aching for more. Caspian lifted his head to look at him, his eyes dark with lust. "Are you sure? Because once we go there, there's no turning back." The weight of Caspian's words sank in, and for the briefest of moments, Sinclair hesitated. But then, he saw it in Caspian's eyes, something more than just lust. It was care, something deep and primal that Sinclair couldn't deny. And suddenly he knew. He was ready. With a sharp breath, Sinclair nodded, his lips finding Caspian's in a kiss so fierce it felt as though the world had collapsed around them. They moved together in a perfect rhythm, bodies grinding against each other, their desperation growing by the second. 13. A wild frenzy. Their kiss deepened, the fire between them blazing higher as their bodies collided with increasing urgency. Every touch, every movement, felt like it was taking them to the edge of something far greater than they had ever known. Caspian pulled back just long enough to position himself between Sinclair's legs, his eyes never leaving Sinclair's as he hovered above him. Sinclair's breath hitched in his throat as he realized what was about to happen. His heart raced, his body trembling with anticipation. Caspian's hand slid down Sinclair's body, his fingers brushing the sensitive skin of his inner thigh, sending shivers through his entire being. He was close, so close, but Caspian wouldn't let him reach the edge. Not yet. Relax, Caspian said softly, his voice low and commanding. I've got you. Sinclair's body was tense with need, but he tried to follow Caspian's command. Slowly, he let himself go, feeling the pressure of Caspian's body against his, the heat of him radiating through every inch of his skin. And then, it happened. Caspian entered him, slowly at first, and Sinclair gasped at the sensation. It was intense, overwhelming, but also so incredibly good. Caspian moved with a rhythm that had Sinclair's head spinning, every thrust sending waves of pleasure crashing through him. It was raw, it was real, and Sinclair couldn't help but moan his approval, his body giving in to Caspian's dominance. Caspian's pace quickened, his hands gripping Sinclair's hips as he pushed deeper, harder, making Sinclair feel like he was on fire. It was a frenzy of motion, of need, of lust, everything blending together in a storm of passion. Sinclair was powerless to stop it, powerless to resist the overwhelming pleasure that washed over him with each thrust. The room was filled with the sound of their breathing, their moans, the wet sounds of skin meeting skin. Every inch of Sinclair's body was alive with sensation, and he couldn't get enough. He moved against Caspian, meeting him thrust for thrust, their bodies moving in perfect harmony. 14. In the aftermath. The tension between them finally broke, and Sinclair felt himself unravel in Caspian's arms. He could feel the pulse of Caspian's release inside him, his name spilling from Caspian's lips as he held him close, their bodies pressed together in the aftermath. Sinclair gasped for breath, his heart pounding in his chest as he lay beneath Caspian, feeling the weight of him, the warmth of his body seeping into his own. He felt overwhelmed. It was as if the entire world had melted away, leaving only the two of them, wrapped in each other's arms. Are you okay? Caspian's voice was soft, his breath still coming in ragged gasps. Sinclair nodded, his hand finding Caspian's and squeezing it. Yeah. More than okay. They lay together in the stillness, their bodies intertwined, and for the first time, Sinclair felt at peace. He didn't need to fight anymore. Caspian had broken through every wall he had built, and now, he couldn't imagine his life without him. I don't want to let you go, Sinclair admitted softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Caspian's lips found his forehead in a tender kiss. You won't have to, he murmured. Not ever. 15. Bound by desire. As the days passed, Sinclair and Caspian found a new rhythm to their relationship, one built on a foundation of trust and passion. They were inseparable, unable to stay away from each other for more than a few hours. The desire between them burned like a wildfire, wild and untamed, consuming everything in its path. Caspian made it clear he wouldn't let Sinclair go, and Sinclair, for once, found himself willing to let someone else take the lead. They navigated their growing bond with intensity, with the weight of their shared passion propelling them forward. Sinclair found himself waking up with Caspian's arms wrapped around him, feeling the warmth of his body, the rhythm of his breathing as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Their mornings were slow and lazy, the world outside not mattering in the least. They made love with an urgency that spoke volumes about the fire between them, their bodies perfectly attuned to each other's needs. As the days turned into weeks, Sinclair couldn't help but fall deeper into the web that Caspian had woven around him. He wasn't just falling for the man, he was falling for the life they were building together, the future that seemed so bright, so full of possibility. I don't know what I would do without you, Sinclair whispered one night, as they lay tangled together beneath the sheets, the moonlight filtering through the windows. Caspian smiled, brushing a lock of hair from Sinclair's forehead. Then you'll never have to find out. 16. Silent conversations. Sinclair sat in the lush garden, the cool breeze gently tousling his hair. The air smelled of fresh blooms, and the soft rustling of leaves was the only sound. He glanced over at Caspian, who sat beside him, eyes closed, enjoying the tranquility of the moment. It was rare for Sinclair to find peace like this. After everything that had happened, he thought he'd never feel this calm again. They hadn't spoken much since the night they first shared that kiss. Caspian had given him space, understanding his need for time. And yet, Sinclair couldn't help but feel drawn to him. There was something undeniably magnetic about Caspian's presence, something that made Sinclair feel safe, even when he didn't know what to expect next. "I used to come here to clear my mind," Caspian said softly, breaking the silence. Sinclair turned to him, noticing how his features softened in the quiet. "I can see why. It's peaceful." "Yeah." Caspian's voice was gentle, almost vulnerable. "I come here when everything feels too loud. It helps me think." He glanced over at Sinclair, a slight smile on his lips. "I used to think I could hide here from everything. But now, it feels like the only thing I want is this." Sinclair felt a flutter in his chest. He wasn't sure what he expected from Caspian, but hearing him speak so openly, so honestly, touched something deep inside him. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Caspian met his gaze, his eyes dark and serious. "I mean this. Being here together." He reached out slowly, brushing his fingertips against Sinclair's hand, a gentle touch that sent a shiver up Sinclair's spine. "I didn't think I'd ever find peace with someone else, but you've made me realize something." He paused, searching Sinclair's face for understanding. "You make me want to try. Want to be better." Sinclair's heart raced, his chest tightening with emotion. Caspian was being honest, vulnerable even, and it felt like a doorway opening, one that Sinclair wasn't sure he was ready to step through. But the pull between them was undeniable. 17. Moments of doubt. The days following their conversation in the garden were quiet, but Sinclair couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between them. Every time he saw Caspian, his chest tightened, his heart beating faster than he wanted to admit. But there were moments of hesitation. The walls he had spent years building around his heart were starting to crumble, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that. He found himself walking the halls of the estate late one evening, unsure of where his thoughts were taking him. Caspian's words echoed in his mind, his confession about wanting to be better, to try. But what did that mean for Sinclair? Could he let someone in after all these years of solitude? Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Caspian approaching, a concerned look on his face. "Sinclair." Caspian's voice was quiet, like he wasn't sure if he had the right to interrupt Sinclair's thoughts. I don't know what I'm doing," Sinclair admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He'd been bottling up his emotions for so long, and now they were spilling over, uncontrollable. Caspian took a step closer, his expression softening. "You don't have to know everything right now," he said, his voice reassuring. "I'm not asking you to rush into anything. I'm just asking you to trust me. And maybe trust yourself a little, too." Sinclair looked down at the floor, the weight of Caspian's words settling on his chest. "I've been alone for so long, Caspian. It's hard to believe that something could be real." Caspian stepped forward, gently lifting Sinclair's chin so their eyes met. "I'm not going anywhere. But I understand your hesitation. I won't push you. I just want you to know that I'm here when you're ready." The sincerity in Caspian's eyes made Sinclair's heart skip a beat. Without thinking, he closed the distance between them, leaning in to rest his forehead against Caspian's. The action was intimate in its own way, tender and filled with the unspoken emotions that had been building between them. For a long moment, they stayed like that, the world outside fading away. Sinclair didn't know what the future held, but he knew that for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. 18. Reaching for each other. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and yet, they both seemed to understand each other more than ever. Sinclair could feel the way Caspian looked at him. There was an intensity to his gaze that left him breathless. And though he tried to push the feelings away, He couldn't ignore the growing desire inside him. But this wasn't about physical attraction, it was deeper than that. Sinclair found himself thinking about Caspian even when they were apart. The way Caspian smiled at him, the way his voice softened when they spoke, the way he made Sinclair feel like he mattered. Every touch felt meaningful, every moment shared felt like a step toward something more. One evening, they found themselves alone in the library. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Sinclair sat in an armchair, a book in his hands, but his mind kept wandering. He couldn't help but glance up at Caspian, who was standing by the window, his profile illuminated by the soft light. Without a word, Caspian walked over to Sinclair, kneeling in front of him. He didn't say anything at first, just reached out to gently take Sinclair's hand in his. Sinclair's breath caught at the softness of his touch. They had shared a kiss before, but this felt different. This was about more than just the physical. It was about the unspoken connection that was growing between them. "Caspian," Sinclair breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to do with all these feelings." Caspian's eyes softened as he leaned closer. "You don't have to do anything," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "Just be with me." And with that, Caspian pressed his lips to Sinclair's, the kiss slow and tender, as if they were both savoring the moment. There were no urgent movements, no rushing. It was simply a kiss that spoke of everything they hadn't yet said. 19. Deep conversations, deeper connections. In the days that followed, Sinclair and Caspian's connection deepened. They spent more time together, talking for hours about everything and nothing. The walls that had once separated them seemed to vanish, replaced by a deep understanding and trust. One evening, after a particularly long day, they found themselves lying side by side on the couch. The silence was comfortable, a reflection of how far they had come. Sinclair turned to Caspian, his voice soft but earnest. "I don't know if I'm ready for all of this," he admitted, his heart racing. "But I know that I want to try." Caspian turned to face him, his expression serious yet warm. "You don't have to be ready, Sinclair. We're in this together, at our own pace." Sinclair reached out, taking Caspian's hand in his. "Thank you," he whispered, "for being patient with me." Caspian smiled, his thumb gently stroking the back of Sinclair's hand. "There's nowhere I'd rather be." Their lips met again, this time with more urgency, but still slow and deliberate. It was a kiss that spoke of the journey they were about to embark on together, a journey of trust, intimacy, and love. Neither of them knew exactly where it would lead, but they were willing to walk that path together. Chapter 20. Taking a step forward. Their relationship was still new, but it was growing stronger every day. Sinclair had never expected to feel this way about anyone, least of all Caspian, but here they were, on the edge of something real and meaningful. One evening, as they sat together in the drawing room, the atmosphere shifted. Sinclair realized he had stopped questioning his feelings, stopped holding back. He was ready to move forward, to take the next step with Caspian. "I think I'm ready," Sinclair said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Ready to see where this can go." Caspian's smile was gentle, but his eyes shone with a quiet intensity. "I've been ready from the moment I met you." Their lips met once again, this time with more passion. It wasn't rushed, but there was an undeniable urgency in their kiss, an understanding that this was just the beginning of something bigger. And as they pulled back, their foreheads resting together, they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. 21. Crossing boundaries. The days blurred into one another as Sinclair and Caspian grew closer. The tension between them shifted, no longer heavy with doubt, but with an unspoken promise of what was to come. It was a new phase in their relationship, one that held both excitement and trepidation. Sinclair could feel the change every time they were near each other. There was a quiet understanding now, a deeper connection that went beyond words. The moments they shared were no longer just fleeting glances or stolen touches, they were meaningful. One evening, as the two of them took a walk through the estate's gardens, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers, Sinclair found himself walking a little closer to Caspian than usual. His heart was pounding in his chest, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was anticipation. He hadn't been able to ignore the way his body reacted to Caspian's presence, how his skin prickled at every touch, every glance. They stopped by the fountain, the water glimmering in the moonlight, casting a soft glow on Caspian's face. Sinclair turned to him, his voice low but steady. "I don't know if I can go back to being the person I was," Sinclair confessed, his hands trembling slightly. "You make me want more than just this solitude." Caspian's gaze softened, his thumb brushing against Sinclair's knuckles. "You don't have to go back," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. "We're building something new. And I'm right here, every step of the way." The words settled in Sinclair's chest, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to peace. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them, pressing his lips gently to Caspian's. It was slow at first, a delicate dance of trust. But as the kiss deepened, Sinclair felt the walls around his heart slowly crumbling. 22. Letting go. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. Sinclair found himself waking up with Caspian on his mind, falling asleep with thoughts of him still lingering in the air. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. There were moments when Sinclair felt like he was losing himself in this new, uncertain connection. But there were also moments when he knew it was exactly what he needed. One evening, after a long day, Sinclair and Caspian were sitting by the fireplace in the main hall. The warmth from the fire cast soft shadows across the room, and the flickering light seemed to echo the growing flame between them. "Do you ever wonder if we're rushing things?" Sinclair asked, his voice hesitant, as he turned his gaze toward Caspian. Caspian tilted his head, his eyes searching Sinclair's face. "We've been slow, Sinclair. We're taking our time," he said, a reassuring smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "But we can't keep pretending that what's between us isn't real." The weight of Caspian's words hung in the air. Sinclair could feel the shift, the way his heart beat faster every time Caspian spoke. It was more than just attraction now. It was a connection that was deep, a connection that felt like fate. He wasn't sure if he was ready to fully give himself to this new relationship, but he knew he didn't want to pull away anymore. Without another word, Sinclair moved closer to Caspian, his hand trembling as he brushed a lock of hair from Caspian's forehead. Their lips met again, slow and deliberate, but this time Sinclair allowed himself to feel the passion that had been building between them. It was more than just a kiss, it was an unspoken promise, one that Sinclair couldn't ignore anymore. 23. A new beginning. As the days passed, Sinclair and Caspian found themselves becoming more and more entwined in each other's lives. The estate that had once felt like a prison to Sinclair now felt like home, especially when Caspian was by his side. They spent long hours talking, laughing, and sharing moments of intimacy that left both of them breathless. The connection between them was undeniable, and neither of them could deny that something beautiful was beginning to take root. One evening, as they shared dinner in the grand dining room, Sinclair found himself looking at Caspian in a new light. There was no longer any uncertainty in his heart. He had let go of the past, the walls he had spent so many years building. And now, he was allowing himself to feel everything that Caspian was offering. "I've been thinking," Sinclair began, his voice quiet but filled with conviction. "Maybe I've been afraid to really live, to really feel. But I don't want to be afraid anymore." Caspian's eyes softened, and he reached across the table to take Sinclair's hand. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. "I'm here, Sinclair. We're in this together." Sinclair nodded, his heart swelling with emotions he wasn't sure how to process. But one thing was clear, he was ready for whatever came next, as long as Caspian was with him. They didn't need to rush, they just needed to trust the journey ahead. 24. In the quiet of the night. Later that night, as the estate was bathed in the soft light of the moon, Sinclair and Caspian found themselves once again alone in the library. The fire was low, casting a warm glow over the room. Caspian was sitting on the couch, his gaze fixed on Sinclair as he approached. There was something about the way Caspian looked at him now that made Sinclair's chest tighten with a mixture of longing and desire. "Sinclair," Caspian said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "you've changed me. I never thought I could feel this way about anyone." Sinclair took a deep breath, his heart racing. He had never been one to wear his emotions on his sleeve, but with Caspian, everything felt different. "I never thought I could feel this way either," he admitted, his voice shaking slightly. "But I do. I do feel something real." Caspian stood up slowly, walking toward Sinclair. Without a word, he cupped Sinclair's face in his hands, his thumb brushing over his lips. The air between them was thick with anticipation, and for the first time, Sinclair didn't feel the need to hold back. Caspian leaned in, pressing his lips to Sinclair's in a kiss that was soft but filled with the weight of everything they had shared. It was a kiss that spoke of trust, of promises yet to be made, and of a love that was growing between them. Quietly, steadily, but undeniably real. As they pulled back, their foreheads rested together, both of them breathing heavily, the silence speaking volumes. It was in that moment that Sinclair realized they were no longer two strangers trying to figure each other out. They were partners. And whatever the future held, they would face it together. 25. Moving forward. With each passing day, Sinclair and Caspian's bond deepened. They no longer questioned what they felt, they simply allowed themselves to experience it, to embrace it. They shared their hopes and fears, their dreams and uncertainties, and slowly but surely, they began to build a life together. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of the estate, looking out over the sprawling gardens below, Sinclair turned to Caspian, his heart full. "I never thought I'd get here," he said quietly. "But now I see. This is where I'm supposed to be." Caspian smiled, his hand resting on Sinclair's back. "This is just the beginning, Sinclair. We have a lifetime ahead of us." Sinclair nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. The future was uncertain, but one thing was for sure, he didn't have to face it alone. Caspian was by his side, and that was all that mattered. As they stood there together, the world stretched out before them, full of possibilities, full of love. And for the first time in a long time, Sinclair felt ready to take on whatever came next.